When did you know it was time to get tested for ADHD, autism, or something else? It took my daughter manifesting symptoms herself as she entered puberty. I began to tell my wife, this sounds like me. Should I be tested for ASD? She thought I definitely should, genuinely, not in an insulting way. I'm 45 and was diagnosed as autistic about 15 months ago. It explains a lot. I took Adderall for an all-nighter in college and everything got really quiet and calm. Everyone else who had taken it was pretty much vibrating. I finished my work in an hour or two and then went home and went to sleep. It was an earth-shattering experience for me. I realized that what I felt on Adderall was what everyone else was feeling normally. It took a few more years to get a diagnosis until I had insurance. But life is so much better now. 47 and finally going in for ADHD testing. I've been putting it off for years because ADHD. My clerkship in law school. I always just thought I was lazy. Turns out I had all but one of the classic symptoms of ADHD. I was seeing a psychiatrist for something else and he just started asking me questions, lots of questions, weird questions. He said I had every characteristic on the checklist for ADHD, not just enough, all of them. I denied it, and then he said, "Let me guess, you were over-prepared for your dissertation defense, but let your driver's license expire more than a year." And he was exactly right. When I realized in my mid-30s that I wouldn't somehow magically get how to human right. My husband is a pharmacist who also has ADHD, and while watching me struggle to get an assignment done for days while I was working from home at 30, he recommended I get tested. I think it's more likely than not that I meet the criteria for autism, but I'm not interested in getting a formal diagnosis. It wouldn't get me anything, and it would just sit there in my medical records as a free do not listen to this jagoff excuse. I ended up filling out a form for my kid's diagnosis. I realized I needed to make an appointment when I had all the same answers for myself. Treatment has completely changed my life. Started with Einstein syndrome, didn't talk until I was close to 3. Then I came out of that gate reading like a jaded 62-year-old Russian moralist, and was bouncing off the walls, so hard my kindergarten teacher actually retired. They thought I was autistic. Turns out I was not. I was dealing with teacher trained up in the 70s and 80s, making their own diagnosis and causing incredible damage to my academic track because, as earlier stated, I wasn't actually autistic. I had a very specific type of hyperlexia that presents independently of autism. It is typically accompanied by Einstein syndrome and ADHD, which was determined when we moved schools and somebody besides a teacher frustrated by the repeal of corporal punishment was allowed to assess me. In my second year of medical school, my life was getting stressful. Was brought up to me I should get officially diagnosed. It ran in my family, and always thought I was a mild case. Turns out I have 1011 of the criteria and save a ton of money from all the stuff I stopped losing. I was told I had ADHD before I even knew what it was. Denied it medication for years because I desperately wanted to be normal. But nope, definitely have it. Even denying it and doing no research on it, so I couldn't know these habits were ADHD related. I am basically an amalgamation of ADHD symptoms. I got on meds last year, and for that screening I scored so high that the evaluator said she would normally be thinking that I was faking it if she hadn't talked to me herself. She said she knew I had it after 10 minutes of talking to me before any of the questions were even asked. I scored a 1010 on one of the scales and a 4 or 5 on the other scale. Luckily I am also smart enough that I can usually keep up with my runaway train of a brain enough to guide it. So I have the kind of ADHD that is why some people mistake it as a superpower. It still comes with a ton of negative side effects though. For me, mostly in the form of volume and emotional regulation issues, also intense anxiety potentially followed by depressive episodes. I get super loud whenever I get excited and feel emotions extraordinarily intensely. I cry basically anytime I feel any emotion at more than a mild level. Happiness, anger, sadness, doesn't matter, crying. I realized I had ADHD when I came across a paper that discussed the emotional dysregulation side of ADHD. It truly was a light bulb moment for me because it explained my entire life and why I'd been such a problematic child, lack of impulse control, and why every minor inconvenience in my life that I perceived to be negative sent me into a downward spiral that was impossible to get out of. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria. I do think there needs to be more education regarding the emotional dysregulation behavioral side of ADHD. It can make life absolutely miserable. I'm 33 and awaiting an assessment. I have a child who was recently diagnosed with autism, and learning about it makes me realize that I show many of the signs of autism and have struggled all of my life because of these quirks. I could spend an entire day in a classroom and not absorb a single ounce of information, because I was too busy thinking about which letters of the alphabet would make the cutest couple. It was when I hit 15 and realized that I just did not relate to my peers. They were all teenagers, going to parties, hanging out in town, obsessed with social media, selfies, makeup, etc. I just wanted to go home and play with my dolls. I still found poop jokes funny. I only watched cartoons. I liked to steal the boys' football and make them chase me to get it. I was basically still like 7 years old in my mind, but I was a student working at levels far above everyone else. I always felt out of place. I finally went for testing for ADHD not long before I graduated university, because I was either doing the same thing for 8 hours straight, or I couldn't sit still for 5 minutes. They referred me for autism diagnosis instead. Got that confirmed in October. At 25, I still feel 15. I have no issues looking after myself and existing as recommended, but I do not function like a normal adult. I had a bad experience with tainted MDMA, and it made my sensory issues go to 11. I had never really thought about them before, just kind of masked and tried to power through. I started learning a lot more about sensory sensitivity, and that led to reading about autism and a frank conversation with my surviving parent. After that, I had to know for sure. I am autistic, but high functioning. I was diagnosed when I was 8 years old. Knowing does nothing to change anything for me now as a 44-year-old with a job and a house. I mean, yeah, I know I have it, but if I didn't know, for me personally, nothing would change. When my kids were showing signs of ADHD, it's the most hereditary trait after height. I took the test, and out of 150 questions, I scored 146. Aced it. The earliest specific example I can remember is when I became obsessed with Michael Jackson when I was 10. He was all I cared about. He was literally my entire life. All I would talk about. Started collecting CDs, watching stuff about him, reading stuff about him. Lasts for a very long time. And ever since then, there are 1 or 2 topics that I get equally invested in. I despise eye contact. I rock back and forth or walk around non-stop when I'm feeling very intense emotions, especially when it comes to my interests. I write little essays for Reddit comments like this all the time, and don't have a political debate with me, because while I can keep it civil, I over-explain everything because I don't want to risk being misunderstood. I've been told by friends with autism that they can smell the autism on me.